All right, welcome to this live stream. I'm Dr. Anna, medical doctor, your med diet doc. And I wanted to go live today. We're going to do a couple of cool things. I got asked a very important question from a viewer of my YouTube channel the other day, and I realized I haven't ever addressed this. The question was about lectins because this is a topic a lot of people are talking about in social media. I think some of my patients have brought up concerns about it. So I wanted to take the time and address some of these things today. Just we're going to have a kind of a quick open discussion about it. I did a little bit of digging and saw some research studies that I want to share with you guys that I think summarize the confusion pretty well. And I also learned a little bit when I was doing the research for it. And then we're going to shift gears a little bit and I want to go over 5 common things that I see a lot of people get wrong about the Mediterranean diet. These things come up over and over again. I hear them from viewers like yourselves on YouTube. I hear them from my patients. I hear them from folks inside my private community, the Healthy After 50 Academy. So we're going to dig into that too. No problem. Long story short, what they asked me was, Dr. Anna, you've never talked about lectins on your channel, and I feel like I don't understand them. And I would love for you to explain a little bit about them because I keep hearing about them in the media. So I realized, the question was correct. I have not talked about this concept of things like lectins or oxalates. These are some of the buzz terms that are being thrown around in social media more in the last year or 2 years than in prior. And so we're going to talk about that right now. So first, somebody said, hi, Dr. Anna. Hello. Yes. And if you're just jumping on, feel free, drop in the chat any questions or comments. I will take the time to answer all of them throughout this call. By the way, this is, if you're just jumping on this, before we dive deep into this lectin conversation, I just want to make it really clear. This is the first of several times I'm planning to go live. And this is sort of experimental, but I'm hoping that you guys like it. And then we can do this more often. So I'm doing it today. I will be live again this coming Saturday. And that's going to be at noon or 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So that's the New York City time zone or Florida time zone. So if you can't make it live today, you're watching this recording, don't worry. I'm going to be live again on Saturday. I'm going to try to fit in some more of these opportunities over the next weeks and months because I think it's starting to get to the time of the year where we're spending less time, maybe outside or in our communities, and we have maybe more opportunity to get together online. So let's talk about lectins. Now, some of you might be wondering, I don't even know what Dr. Anna's talking about right now. What are lectins? So lectins, and I'm going to share my screen to an article that starts to summarize this really well. I apologize in advance. I'm going to get a little technical. Well, it's not something to apologize about. I am going to get a little technical here with a bit of scientific jargon. If that's not your thing, just bear with me. Other people might be curious about it. So it's hard to answer some of these questions without talking technicalities. So every now and then I am going to jump into a little bit of that. Okay, so I see my screen shared. I'm assuming it's shared for others. There's an article, a research article that I found about this topic, and it's an amazing summary article that kind of puts the whole story together. So what are lectins? Lectins are actually a type of protein. So it's a molecule, but it falls in the category of proteins. They tend to bind to carbohydrates, and they exist in several of our different types of foods. These are naturally occurring compounds in plants. And when human beings consume plant foods, so think of things that are plants that we eat, like a whole grain or a vegetable or a nut or a seed or a bean. Inside those foods, there's a lot of different types of chemicals. Some of the chemicals in plants exist for the plants because when the plants are alive and growing, they help protect the plant. And plants have evolved over thousands of years or millennia, I guess we could argue, to become the way that they are so that they can survive in their environment. So there are these types of molecules that exist in plants that when human beings eat them, they can have an effect on our body, just like a vitamin or a mineral. But there's a category of molecules that exist in plant foods that have sort of gotten this nickname like anti-nutrients. So there are different types of them. Amongst them are something called lectins, you might have heard of those, or oxalates, you might have heard of those. There are so many other terms that are inclusive of this category that I might lose some of you when I start to talk about it. But what you need to know is that they can include tannins, they can include phytates, phytoestrogens, um, sort of different molecules that have properties in our body that can bind to carbohydrates, so carbs, sugars that exist in our body, and give an effect and sometimes a negative effect. So that's why people get concerned about them. So, what do I mean by give an effect? So, what we're talking about is that when we consume a food that comes from nature, which is also true of animal foods or meat or dairy, there is more than one thing inside that food. There are many types of molecules, many types of compounds in an individual naturally occurring food. So there's different purposes that those things have. Now, lectins are a type of molecule that exists in pretty high amounts in certain plant foods in particular, such as whole grains or beans, some seeds, some vegetables. And if they are consumed in a high amount, there is some thought that that can be sort of like toxic to our body in the sense that um, there some of those molecules or those compounds have been known to bind other compounds in our body, such as healthy nutrients that our body needs, like calcium. And the thought is if these compounds from the plant are high levels and we're eating them, then it means they're binding other things in our body that we need, like a mineral, like calcium. And when they're bound, our body can't use the thing we need well. So in this example, if something binds up the calcium that we have, we can't use the calcium to keep our bones healthy, for example. And that causes some concern. That's where this term anti-nutrient came into place. But this conversation and this topic is really nuanced. And I'm going to explain to you why right now. So, what this article talks about, this is in the journal called Nutrients, and this was 5 years ago at the time of this recording. So, this was a 2020 article. It's a very well organized discussion about this topic of these anti-nutrients, of which lectins fall in the category. So the authors here, they wrote, there have been some concerns raised about whether they're beneficial to our body or that they cause this sort of anti-nutrient effect and thus cause some kind of toxicity. And the reason people are concerned about this is that some people get symptoms from eating certain plant foods high in these compounds. For example, beans or whole grains. People get things like gassy, they get bloated, they may get joint pain. Some people get headaches or migraines. Some people get fatigue or brain fog. I mean, there's so many symptoms people can feel that they sort of detect a pattern when they eat certain foods, they get more of their symptoms. And this is one theory behind that. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to this topic, we need to understand, well, okay, what foods are these compounds high in? And B, do they actually get into our body at high levels? Just because they exist at high levels in the food doesn't mean when we eat those foods, the high levels come across. And here's the nuance to this conversation that I think it's a really simple point, but most people are confused about this. So I want to be extremely clear. So these phytonutrients or these plant molecules that have these potentially anti-nutrient effects are broken down and degraded, if not completely eliminated, by a lot of cooking methods. The way I always learned about this when I was in nutrition school is that when we have specifically high heat with moisture methods of cooking, so think about your steaming, your boiling, that could also include sometimes sauteing, those methods of cooking break down things like lectins to the point where sometimes they go away entirely. So just because a bean has a lot of lectins in it, the way it's naturally growing in the plant form when it's still attached to the bean plant before the beans are picked, doesn't mean that when we eat the food the way we do, which is after we cook it, that it's actually going to have those high levels of lectins in our body. And we see this. So this article has a really nice table, and I want us to look at this together because I think this is so important. So this is a table 1. I think you guys can see it now in this article, and it's summarizing kind of bird's eye view. What are these plant compounds? Which foods do they come from? And what is the thought behind what is called their clinical implications, or the effects they have on our body, or the symptoms we get from them, right? So the main category we're talking about today are the lectins. But as I mentioned in the beginning, there are other categories of these compounds, or rather, there are other compounds within this big group, such as oxalates. You might have heard about that. I think that's become kind of buzzworthy in the media. There are other things called phytates, goitrogens. So those are things that are thought to maybe bind up the thyroid gland, and they can cause things like hypo or low thyroid levels in the bloodstream, because if they're binding up the thyroid, then our body can't use the thyroid hormone to do its thing. Then there are other things called phytoestrogens, phyto meaning plant. Estrogen, a lot of us are familiar with what an estrogen molecule is. It's a type of hormone, sex-based hormone, higher levels in women than men. And there's some thought, and you've heard about this probably online. This is within the same conversation. Something like soy or soy products, tofu, tempeh, soybeans, edamame, soy milk, that these things act like estrogen in the body, and they do something called disrupt the hormones. And that's the scientific way of, or that's the layman's term way of saying endocrine disruption. I want us to be very, very clear. All of these things, like this whole column on the right of these suggested clinical implications, this is not guaranteed, nor is this necessarily true. This actually does derive from more theory that's rooted in truth, but the nuance to the conversation makes the difference, because just because the plants have these compounds, and these compounds may have these effects in some contexts, maybe there's several animal studies that this article describes, doesn't necessarily mean it's happening in your body if you eat these foods, okay? So let's be very clear about that. And then tannins, a lot of people have heard of tannins. Why is that something we know? Well, a lot of people know of tannins from wine. There's a lot of types of wine that have high tannin levels. And I personally enjoy drinking wine. At different times in my life, I've gotten to taste lots of wines. When I lived in Italy, I lived in France. I spent a lot of time in Europe, and I got to try all different kinds of wines. And it's a lot of fun to taste these things in, healthy doses, small amounts. But at the same time, those compounds can cause people effects. So one of the things that I hear often from patients is they can't drink red wine because it gives them headaches. And some of the thought behind that is, well, could be the alcohol, but if they tell me they're having a beer, or they tell me they're having a vodka drink, at Christmas when they celebrate, with their family every now and then, they don't have the same effect. Maybe it's the tannins. We don't know. So there's a lot to be said about this topic. It's a big topic. We're obviously not going to talk about it forever. And I only wanted to take a few minutes in the beginning here to actually address this lectin conversation. But we need to lay the groundwork here to know what are we talking about. We're talking about these compounds that exist in plants that have some thought to be anti-nutrient effect. But here's the kicker. So when we're talking about this topic, it is literally useless to talk about this topic without thinking about, well, how are the foods that are high in these compounds actually eaten? So actually, let me go back to table 1 for 1 second. Looking at this second column, the food sources, what are you going to see? You're going to see legumes, which is usually like beans, cereal grains. Those are whole grains, guys. It's the whole wheat. It's the amaranth, that's the buckwheat, that's the bulgur, that's some, I guess it could be in some pseudo grains like quinoa, it's in your farro, all these things that we love to eat in the Mediterranean diet, nuts and seeds, fruits and vegetables, etc. And then you could see this entire column, there's a lot of overlap, specific kinds of vegetables, specific kinds of beans, millet, amaranth, quinoa. So those are the pseudo cereals, like I mentioned. So these are the foods that we find these components. And like I mentioned, tannins, where are we going to see that? Tea, cocoa, which is in chocolate, grapes, which is in that red wine that I talked about, berries, apples, fruits, nuts, beans, whole grains. So a lot of foods have these compounds. So then why, you have to ask yourself, when we start talking about this conversation and we start thinking about this topic, why, if these things have negative effects on the body potentially, why isn't everyone getting sick from them? Well, that's because when we eat these things, we're not eating these foods raw in the levels that, with the high levels of these compounds, because these are foods that over human history, humans have figured out, well, if they ate these foods raw, they get sick. And why is that? Well, because the raw form of these foods, things like beans and whole grains, can you imagine eating a raw, dried bean? I mean, you would have a very hard time chewing that, but you would get a huge stomach ache probably. You might get other kinds of symptoms. And the whole reason for our cooking is because we are basically reducing the level of these anti-nutrients when we cook the foods. So, what are these cooking methods? Soaking, boiling, auto, excuse me, autoclaving, which is like super high heat oven cooking, germination, which is like where I don't know if any of you have ever played with like grains before, but they can sprout and they can germinate and spread. So that's that process. Fermenting a food where you have like the healthy bacteria that's turning it over. So think of your kimchi, for example, that's a fermented food, or yogurt is fermented. Soaking, boiling, steaming. Look at the pattern here, guys. Soaking, boiling, steaming, all these high heat and moist cooking methods nearly eliminate the levels of these compounds often. That is why humans have come to cook certain foods typically. So we are always cooking, soaking our beans, cooking our whole grains, usually boiling them. These are the methods that are dropping these levels. So the reality of the story is that when people are eating these plant foods and they're properly cooking them, they're really barely consuming these anti-nutrients, the lectins, the oxalates. So I want you guys to think for yourselves when you hear this topic, because I think there's a lot of fear inside of this. And I understand where it comes from, to be honest. I'm not going to sit here and tell you, oh, this has no scientific evidence and blah blah blah. No, there's actually, I'm showing you guys an entire article that's describing where some of the concern comes from. But the nuance is that we have to make sure we're talking about this correctly when we're talking about it. If we're talking about lectins in foods, and we're talking about those foods when they're eaten as a cooked form, then we're not really talking about lectins in our foods, because most of those lectins are eliminated. Now, absolutely, it's possible someone could still get sick if they eat foods that have, if they eat a certain plant food or if they eat a certain food at all. There's no rule that everybody needs to eat the same diet and that everybody should be able to handle the same foods. We all have our differences. We have a lot of different stuff going on in our health. And I want to make it really clear, this discussion is from a place of education. This is not a medical advice. I'm not talking to any of you specifically. There are several different people who've been popping in and out of this call already. But you need to think for yourselves when someone starts talking about anything diet related, you have to take that conversation with like a grain of salt and think, well, does this make sense for me? Let's say people are making you scared of eating certain vegetables, but those are vegetables that you don't really buy or eat because you don't like them, then it's not really a concern for you personally, right? Same thing with beans or certain whole grains. And like, if it doesn't work for you, leave it. But that doesn't mean it's bad for everyone. So you always want to keep in mind what works for you as an individual with your body and your health situation and your personal preferences with what you like to eat. Now, we could obviously go into way more detail about this discussion. Um, I wanted to just point out here that there have been some studies about like very limited research studies, but there are some, and this article summarizes a few where that there's like some concern for our health based off of these compounds. And there have been some case reports of food poisoning of raw or improperly cooked beans that have been well documented. I think this one study it showed from the United Kingdom over the span of over 10 years there were 50 cases of food poisoning specifically, and they were all, I think all of the cases, caused by not enough cooked kidney beans. So inadequately prepared kidney beans. So what's the lesson here? Is it that kidney beans are toxic? No, it's you could see how somebody would kind of pull that out and say, well, this means we shouldn't be eating kidney beans because they're going to cause food poisoning. But that is fear mongering and that is misleading the evidence of what the science is actually telling us. Because the reality is, well, no, those were situations where those beans were not cooked correctly. And had they been cooked correctly, it's hard to say whether or not the food poisoning would have occurred. So you have to have a thinking hat on when people are talking about this topic. Um, so if you have more questions about that, throw it in the chat. I will answer them. I haven't seen anybody throw their questions in, but I'm sure after I post this live stream, more questions are going to come up. That's what always happens. I tend to shy away from talking specifically about like research and science on my YouTube channel, not because I don't love it. I do. It's a huge part of nutrition and medicine, and I'm thinking about it a lot, all day long with the patient work that I do. But the problem online is a lot of people take it out of context and they kind of twist the argument to induce fear, to induce hype. And my goal here in this space with you guys is that I'm trying to just support all of you thinking through this for yourselves in a correct way, like in a clear-minded way, so that we don't need to get twisted. Because at the end of the day, there are so many health benefits that come from plant foods, like way more than are the evidence of people having problems with plant foods. And that's in general. So we know they're full of vitamins and minerals, and these are pretty low calorie foods, and they give us things like fiber, and they have lots of flavor. They're very versatile, and they tend to be kind of cheap compared to animal foods and products. So please, you know, think through yourself what makes sense for you to eat, but also there are so many health benefits of plant foods, and almost across the board, all the different types of plant-based diets have been shown to correlate or sync up with really positive benefits and outcomes for our health overall. Less obesity, less heart disease, less dementia, fewer cases of certain types of cancers, less diabetes a lot of the time. Like, it is so important that people eat the diet that's best for them. But for most of us, that should include a lot of plant foods. Most of us. I can't personally think of any patients I see, for example, where they shouldn't be eating any plant foods. It's almost like unheard of. But I never like to say never because you don't know. Everybody's different. I hope that that makes sense. And I hope I've clarified a little bit this conversation and how we should be thinking about it. Again, there's a lot more that could be said. One could stand here all day long and cherry pick different research studies that showed this toxicity and this problem this person had. But like that actually wouldn't be useful for any of you because A, that just causes a lot of confusion. But B, the thing about science and research is that the you're never going to be able to derive the big conclusion from any one study. You're not. That's why I'm actually showing you guys a summary study. Like this is called a review article. What that means is, if I go to the bottom, I'll show you. Not all of us are familiar with research. So a review article is going to have summarized what other research articles have said about the topic. So these are the references. You can find this at the bottom of any research article. Look how many references are in this article. I mean, it just goes and goes and goes. I think we're up to 300 references. Oh, we got close. 272. That tells you a lot. In order for somebody to have drawn the conclusions that are written down in this research paper, they had to have parsed through almost 300 other research articles. So that just tells you this is a strong, like, this is considered like stronger evidence of the arguments of what the writers are saying here, because this is no one study's conclusion. This is a summary of many studies. Okay. So that's really important to understand. There was also, I'm going to unshare and reshare for a second. There was another article I wanted to just point out really quick before we totally leave the topic of lectins. And again, if any of you have questions about this, put it in the chat because that's what I'm here for. I'm live. I'm happy to answer any of your questions about it. This one. All right. Okay. So this was another article, and it is about improving this one was nice. Improving human dietary choices, meaning what you choose to eat, through understanding the tolerance and the toxicity of pulse crop constituents. So what they're talking about are plants that are like grains and beans, I believe. Anyway, we don't have to get into the nitty gritty of this article, but long story short, they're specifically talking about things like chickpeas, dried beans, dried peas, lentils. These are typical like grains and beans that human beings have been eating for more than 8,000 years. And suddenly, in the last couple of decades, people have gotten concerned about it. I'm telling you one thing, one of the reasons that I love to teach the Mediterranean diet and lifestyle is because it is an approach to eating that's rooted in reality over history. That tells us so much from the side of nutrition. It is so hard for us to ever fully conclude anything from a controlled trial in a lab. And I also don't think it's necessarily so useful for general population guidelines of what to eat, because you have so much evidence. What have humans been eating for a long time that have gotten us to this point? Well, for example, they've been eating lots of grains and beans, and they've been cooking them. And when they're cooking them, they're not getting toxic and having catastrophic health effects necessarily. Now, I'm sure somebody could take what I said and cherry pick that and say, oh, well, you know, what about this problem? What about that? Well, what about a lot of stuff, right? I'm just telling you, think for yourself logically. What makes sense? This was a really important point. What this article also pointed out here, specifically over the last 7 decades, these foods, chickpeas, the grains, etc., they have pretty much fallen out of favor. They've been displaced from our Western diet by a lot of animal foods and specifically proteins that we're eating in higher amounts. Now, protein has its place. Don't get me wrong. I'm all about eating enough protein. But at the same time, we have removed a lot of fiber from our diet. We're eating way more processed food. So it's super hard to say, well, are we getting symptoms because of these things called lectins or oxalates? Or is that potentially just a distraction from us thinking about more of the big picture patterns here, which is in general, we're eating way less fiber than our ancestors were eating. We're eating way more processed food. We're eating a lot more sugar. We're eating a lot more, etc. Right? So thinking about the big picture of, well, what are the themes here? As we've seen things like obesity rise, what are the themes? And this is something that I'm always teaching in my Healthy After 50 Academy. If you're not familiar with that, I have a link in the description below this video, but it's a space where I have a 6-week weight loss program. I have a free version for those of you who want to dig in and get like way more out of it. I do have an option that you can dive into like a premium experience where I give you so many more resources to get, some benefit. But in the Healthy After 50 Academy, what we're always focused on is that big picture, that lifestyle component of, okay, we can tweak up our diet, we can address our exercise, we can make certain changes, but how we feel overall about things matters so much. Are we living in balance? Are we addressing all the aspects of our health that are making an impact on how we feel and how we're doing overall? We try to emphasize that a lot in the Healthy After 50 Academy. So if you are an adult over 50 and you're not part of our group, you're definitely going to want to jump in. And again, I have a link in the description below for how you can get involved and join us. It is totally free to join, and we just have a lot of fun over there. Okay, so I have a question from a participant. Is there an easy way to determine an ideal weight for ourselves relative to height? Oh, sure. Okay, so so I guess we're going to put to close here the lectin conversation. Let's end that. Navy Mom Proud, I'm going to answer your question, and then we'll switch gears into the next part of this, which I've prepared for you guys. So, how do we figure out our ideal weight relative to our height or age? So, this comes from lots of like data from large populations, and that's where the BMI calculation has actually come into play. Um, if you're not familiar with what the BMI is, it's a calculation of like your height to your weight. It is not perfect. It is just a quick and easy number for us to calculate, and it doesn't take into account your age. So when we're thinking about your ideal weight, it's usually relative to being male or female, and then your height. So actually, what I can do is I'm going to show you guys a calculator just so you can do this for yourselves anytime. But if you're going to the doctor, they're calculating your BMI. Now, there's other ways to calculate what's ideal for your body. So again, it's not perfect, as I mentioned, but it's nice. It's quick and easy. So let me reshare. Dun, dun. Okay. This is a good question, and I want to make sure everybody knows how to do this for themselves because it's going to make your life way easier. Oh, I see what the problem is. There we go. I need to put it in its own window. Okay. Yeah, I want everyone to know how to calculate their own BMI. If you don't know, I'm going to show you right now. And if you do know, great. This is a good refresher for all of us. So, how do we do this? I'm just on the general National Institutes of Health website. There's a gazillion places you could find how to calculate this, but they have a nice, easy BMI calculator. So, depending on where you live, of course, I'm in the US. You can probably tell by my accent, but some of you are living in other parts of the world where you use the metric system. I was trained in Italy, so I got really used to the metric system. I actually prefer it. But in the US, we're still, we're not going to change. We do feet and inches and pounds. So let's just take in theory, an example. What's an average height for a female? It might be 5'5". I think it's like the national average or so. I don't know what's an average weight for an adult female who's 5'5". Well, might be, let's call it 150 pounds. That sounds pretty standard. So what you do is you just put in your height and you put in your weight and you click calculate your BMI. And it's going to give you a number. This calculation, based off of somebody who's 5'5" and weighing 150 pounds, is currently 25 on the BMI scale. Now, the question that Navy Mom Proud asked was not how do I know, but how do I figure out my ideal weight? So the way you figure that out is usually most of us can't just change our height. Of course, as we get older, we shrink a little bit because of the vertebrae. The space in between starts to get a little smaller, but it's not going to be dramatic. The thing that often changes is our weight. Based off of the BMI, there are different ranges that are considered like out of health and within health parameters. So, of course, we have our numbers, our calculations that often fall into the underweight category. We have what's considered the healthy range. We have what's considered the overweight range. And then obesity has several different levels. So let me give you guys an example. Let's say you were someone who, you wanted to figure out what's your ideal body weight. An easy way to do that is you flip this around and say, okay, if I'm 5'5" and the actual math here, let me see if I can show you guys. BMI math. It's weight. And so the actual BMI calculation, let me see. Is this part sharing in the live? Yes, it is. Okay. So the BMI calculation itself is in the metric system. So if you're in the US and you're using feet, inches, and then pounds, you have to actually do the conversion to do the math. But the way those numbers come out, like where do we get that 25 from actually? It was your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. So that's very dizzying for most people. It's usually a lot easier to just plug and chug the numbers. But a healthy BMI is anywhere from 18.5 to 24.9, as you guys could see from this range. Okay. So if you wanted to understand your ideal body weight, and again, this is a range, it's not a hard number. There's no truth to being, I need to be 125 pounds, for example. That's not real. It's like you have a range of what's considered healthy for your body, most likely. And so you could always do the math and see, well, what would my weight be at the 18.5 BMI based on my height? What would my weight be at the 24.9 BMI based on my height? And then you look at those two numbers and you see your range. But there are nuances to this conversation. BMI is not perfect. What do I mean? Since we looked at what's included in BMI is just your height and your weight. Well, what makes your weight what it is on the scale? A lot of different things. It has to do with how much water your body is holding, how much like lean tissue you have or muscle mass, your bone density and size, as well as things like fat tissue, belly fat. People are often thinking about it. So there's a lot of different things that make your body weigh what it does. So it's not correct to say if your BMI is this, it means this is how much fat is on your body. The BMI is not telling you percentage of body fat. There are other ways of measuring that. There's other ways of calculating it that are more precise that you usually have to go to like a specialty sports clinic to get that done. And that's not something routinely we do in the doctor's office. We instead use this calculation most of the time because it's quick and easy, and it gives us a pretty close estimation of how you're doing. I can also tell you the way you hold the weight on your body is going to affect your health differently. So, for example, we know that there is a difference in the fat that exists under your skin. So, for a lot of people, especially women, I have a lot of women as patients. So, we're always talking about this, like that fat that hangs under people's arms or the fat in between their thighs. That is what's called subcutaneous fat, or fat that is hanging out under your skin. That is not the same in terms of its effect on your health, or rather impact on your health, as it is fat that exists inside of your belly surrounding what are called your visceral organs or your core organs, things like your liver, your kidneys, your pancreas, your stomach, etc. The fat that lives around those central organs has more negative effect on your metabolism than the fat under the skin. They have a big difference. So the problem with BMI, one of them I mentioned before, is it doesn't tell us which type of body mass we're talking about when we talk about the total mass. It doesn't tell us if we're talking about muscle, bone, water weight, or fat weight. And then the other problem is, even if there is a lot of fat, where is that fat distributed on your body? Because where it is makes a difference in your health. Two people who weigh the same and are the same height, and one person holds all their fat, for example, in their thighs and their bum, and their belly feels flat, and the other person has a huge belly that extends outward, and they have like chicken legs with little muscle. Not the same health effects, not the same at all. So we need to really be thinking through what makes sense for us. This is why it's important to talk to your personal doctor about your personal situation, because not everybody's the same. And even two people who weigh the same should maybe need to have different goal weights based off of a lot of things, like what we talked about. What is absolutely true for pretty much everybody is that the more muscle tissue you have on your body, the better across the board within healthy parameters. Some people are doing things like steroid injections to beef up at the gym. I'm not talking about that. And usually the viewers on my YouTube channel are not the people in those categories. I tend to bring a little bit of an older crowd, which I enjoy very much. So we're often worried about the opposite. People in their later years, for example, after 50, or for a lot of women, it's like after menopause, and they're getting into those older age brackets, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, often have the problem of too little muscle tissue. A condition called sarcopenia can develop in a lot of people. That's wasting of your muscle. That is really dangerous for the body. So we actually want to sometimes increase our weight in the sense of we're trying to increase the amount of muscle on our body to support our health overall and our metabolism and fight against a lot of these chronic diseases. So, there's a lot that goes into this discussion. I won't say more about that right now because I want to just take the last 15 minutes of the hour, and I want to run through a few things with you guys that I prepared. But I hope that clarified it for you, Navy Mom Proud. Um, if you're still with me, maybe you can comment after, let me know if that answered your question. But this is important. This is important for all of you to understand, because when you're thinking about your own weight, and a lot of people need to lose weight in the United States, there's no question about that. You have to think a little bit at a deeper level, is more than just the number on the scale. You have to think, what is my general body composition? If I am overweight, in what way am I overweight? Do I have too much fat mass? And if so, where is the fat hanging out in my body? Is my belly really protuberant? Is it like sticking out? Do I hold my weight kind of evenly all over the place? If you've ever had like a CT scan, or some people get DEXA scans as they get older for their bones, sometimes those scans can give us a lot of information about where we hold our fat, and that can give us clues as to how the fat is affecting our metabolism, amongst other things like blood tests. So you want to always keep that in mind too. But across the board, there's no question. Everybody needs to be thinking about, how do I maintain and maximize the healthy amount of muscle that I have? Really only two ways to do that. You got to eat enough protein for your body to meet your needs, and you have to do resistance training, or things that are making your muscles kind of squeeze and push against resistance or load. In other words, weightlifting or weight training. That's not to say that everyone needs to do it in the same way. You got to start where you're at, but like, those are things to think about. If you want to improve your health, if you want to maybe lose some fat, those are some key strategies. Okay. That being said, we're going to switch gears again. If other people have questions, drop them in the chat. I will absolutely answer them. Now, I'm going to switch gears into just a few slides that I have, because I think this is going to tie our conversation up nice and tight. Now, as a reminder, I mentioned this earlier, I am going live today. Obviously, if you're watching the recording, no problem. I'm going to keep doing this. I really like showing up live for you guys. I enjoy just teaching and in this sense, and kind of answering questions in real time. I think it's a lot more fun, and it's authentic. And you guys are hearing me just kind of talk from a place of, yeah, I looked into this, but this is like truly what I think. This is very unscripted. I'm just thinking and talking to the camera through this material. And so hopefully this is enjoyable for you guys. At the same time, I'm going to keep doing this. So I'm going live again in 4 days on Saturday, which is November 15th. It's going to be at noon Eastern Standard Time, so which is New York City time zone. So it's 12 p.m. I'm going live again. I hope all of you can join me there. We're going to have a lot of fun. I'm going to have time for more question and answer and such. So, bring your thoughts, bring your questions. We'll just keep doing this. Okay, let me share this last little bit. Whoops. 1 second. Okay. So to wrap up our conversation today in this, I don't know if I'm going to call this a show, in our show. I want to just go over something I'm constantly answering these questions, guys. Things people are getting wrong about the med diet. If you followed me on YouTube, you know that the Mediterranean diet and lifestyle is something tried and true to my heart. I trained for medicine in Italy. I spent 6 years living there. I love the culture. I've spent a lot of time in other countries around the Mediterranean, and I just fell in love with this way of living. And I realized a lot of people don't understand what it's about, but it's so famous in medical literature. And probably many of you who've ever gone to a cardiologist, you've been recommended to eat the Mediterranean diet. Or if you have an autoimmune disease, maybe you go to a rheumatologist, maybe they told you eat a Mediterranean diet. And a lot of the time people say, I have no idea how to do that. Even my doctor couldn't explain it to me well. And it's something that I've learned after being in medicine for some time. This is super confused by a lot of people, including health professionals. So here's a little summary. We're just going to do like a quick 10-minute combo. These are 5 things you might be getting wrong about the Mediterranean diet. So, common myths. Do not feel bad if you don't know some of this stuff. That's why I'm going over it, because I think most people don't. So, that being said, what's number one? Number one that people think they hear Mediterranean diet, or I haven't tried Mediterranean. So it's just a diet, right? Like I tried paleo and I tried keto and I've tried the Atkins diet back when that was a thing, and sometimes carnivore. No, already the conversation is kind of confused because really the Mediterranean diet isn't a diet like other diets at all. It is really a lifestyle. It is sort of this complete way of living your day to day life that includes addressing things within the diet, so foods, but it's not about having rules or restrictions. It's really like the combination of what you eat, the way you eat, how much you're moving or not moving, and how you live your life in terms of your relationship to other people, staying social and socially engaged. These things are core components of the Mediterranean diet. And where does this come from? How did it become to be? Well, this comes from the part of the world that is surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, where there's tons of like old ancient cultures. Think about like Egypt and the old Ottoman Empire, where's Turkey, and there's Southern Europe, there's Greece, there's Italy, there's Spain, Northern Africa. I mean, these are old ancient cultures, and they have been living the way they live for a while, and it happens to work. So that's the concept. This gets pulled out of epidemiological research from recognizing that people have been living a certain way in this region for a while. And by and large, they have lower rates of a lot of the chronic diseases historically that have been plaguing a lot of Western nations, for example, the United States. And there's a lot to be said about that. So when scientists started recognizing this pattern, they were doing a bit of research. Some of you might know who Ansel Keys was. He kind of brought this concept to the forefront. And he was one of the first publishers to talk about this in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. He noticed a pattern, and the pattern was, oh, these people, they tend to eat eat meals in these large social gatherings, meals that are kind of slow. They take their time, they enjoy. They're sipping things, they're eating things, they're sharing, they're telling stories, they're laughing, they're singing, they're dancing all throughout the dinner. So it's like the opposite of the way we eat in the US now, which is usually rushed in the car, sitting at our desk. We have 10 minutes. Oh my gosh, then I got to get back to work. Like it's the opposite of that. It's also how you're living through the whole entirety of your day. It's not just about the meals, but how much are you moving? Are you walking? Are you taking the stairs? Are you doing gardening? Or are you doing yard work? Are you staying engaged with your neighbors and your family and your friends? Are you going out and being part of your community? Like literally all of that is Mediterranean diet. And a lot of people don't understand this. So when we look through science papers, medical research, and we see all these amazing health benefits about the med diet, I'm telling you, it is not just about how much olive oil or walnuts they ate. And that's where people get really confused because they think if I just take a shot of olive oil every day, I'm kicking my diabetes to the curb. And it's not to say that that's bad for you. Olive oil is fantastic, but that's not telling the whole story. And you're also doing yourself a disservice because life is really full and wonderful and enjoyable when we stay engaged in this way. So that's like off the bat, we have to understand that as what we're talking about. Because if we don't even have that down, we're not going to get the rest of it, right? But the truth is, this is not that complicated to apply. So then, what's myth number 2? I hear it all the time. So that being said, that the Mediterranean diet means you need to eat specific foods. Well, no, you don't. Again, there's no hard rules or restrictions when it comes to the med diet. Now, there's no question that that part of the world, There are certain things that grow naturally in that region that have found their way into those cuisines kind of famously. Things like tomatoes, olives, olive oil, fish, some beans, certain whole grains, etc. But the thing to pay attention to is that the real benefit of the Mediterranean diet and lifestyle is that because it's a lifestyle, there's no one specific food that's going to really be the kicker, the linchpin. It's that combination of everything. So that being said, if there's foods that you personally don't like, such as fish, I know lots of people tell me I want to eat Mediterranean, but I hate fish, so I can't. Well, that's really not true and that's not accurate. And I'm sorry people have come to believe that because you can absolutely eat Mediterranean and follow a Mediterranean lifestyle without ever having a piece of fish. So we need to recognize there's a lot of flexibility built in to following a Mediterranean approach to eating and living that can just navigate the foods you like and dislike, no problem. It doesn't really matter. And this can be true across the board. Now, I don't often hear that people don't like olive oil, but olive oil is pretty much the most commonly consumed fat in that region in terms of like making salad dressings and cooking, making sauces, etc. That being said, it is possible that some people can have an allergy to certain fruits, and olives are technically a fruit. I do know of somebody who has a severe allergic reaction if they come into contact with any olives or olive oil. So, obviously, you need to think about your own personal health situation when you make your decisions. But most of the time, the commonly consumed oil is olive oil, and there are lots of variety of foods. We're going to talk about this more in a second. But just understand there is no mandatory ingredient list required. No matter what you like, no matter how you like to eat, no matter which foods you can't stand. Like if you can't stand the smell of garlic or it makes you sick, you don't need to eat any one thing to do this correctly or to do this well. So just keep in mind, you can always twist this diet to make it into your own that works for you. So then, what are, I kind of already said this, but some of these health benefits that are just so prominent amongst the research of the med diet are things like heart health benefits. So a lot of people come to me on YouTube, especially, and they say, "Hi, I found your channel because my cardiologist told me to eat Mediterranean, and I was really confused. And your channel has made that a lot easier." So I'm so glad you made your way here. But this is like one of the most common things that a lot of people are aware of, that the heart healthy benefits that come along with eating Mediterranean. And then there are things like diabetes prevention. It's been showed across the board. Eating a lot of variety of plant-based foods and a lot of heart-healthy foods that include things like fish, some poultry, certain, and we're going to talk about this in a second. Some certain dairy sources have been shown to help people control their blood sugar, to help people control how sensitive their insulin is, or their body is to insulin is a better way of saying that. Other things that have people have noticed benefits for are like their brain health. So the cognitive function decreases risks of things like certain dementias. That's very important, and this is a growing problem. Dementia is always on the rise in our population. So if that's you, then you realize you might need to be thinking about how to protect your brain, and this is a fantastic way of doing that. Also, there are certain kinds of cancer that are correlated with having severely or strongly reduced risk when somebody follows a healthy eating approach like Mediterranean eating. And so this is not true for all cancer, but there are several different types of cancers that are really common. And so just, pay attention if you're somebody that's concerned about your own personal cancer risk, talk to your doctor or do your own research online and see like, hey, this might be able to help me and I'm kind of curious about it. Or you can always ask me on another live and I'll try to do my best to answer that. So then that brings us to myth number 3. So myth number 3 is that the med diet is a weight loss diet. And the reason why this is a myth is because it's not that that's false. It can absolutely be true, but it's not true necessarily unless you're trying to make it true. So what do I mean? Maybe I didn't explain that well. What I mean is when it comes to thinking about weight loss, it is not enough to just think about which foods to select. You end up you have to incorporate the aspect of how much total food am I eating? In other words, how many total calories? Plus how much movement am I getting? Like it's that combination that's going to help us get to a weight loss place. Now, this is something I talk about all the time. This is why I made the 6-week Mediterranean weight loss challenge, which is a program that I have inside my Healthy After 50 Academy. If you are not familiar with it and you're curious to hear more, you have to join me on Saturday, where I'm going to describe it a little bit. And we're going to talk a lot about weight loss on Saturday. That's a topic that I want to be addressing in the live stream. So if you are interested in losing weight, Mediterranean is a fantastic way to get there. But just eating Mediterranean foods is not necessarily going to guarantee you any weight loss. You have to do some measuring the way we would do for any weight loss diet, calorie tracking, exercise, getting more movement. The cool thing, though, about Mediterranean is that because it's so balanced in nutrition, you end up getting really full from the meals. So you ultimately end up snacking way less, if not no more snacking at all. And with that, people end up losing weight because it's the snacking that often leads to those extra calories creeping in that lead to weight gain in us or preventing us from losing weight. And so if you can curb the snacking for a lot of folks, that gets the job done. And the cool thing about Mediterranean eating is that it emphasizes very balanced meals that are kind of solid and sufficient in calories so that you stay full for many hours until you get to your next meal. So, for example, if you eat enough food at lunch, you don't necessarily need to eat anything until you get to your dinner. And same thing for breakfast. If you're a breakfast person and you eat a sufficient breakfast, you're not necessarily munching on pretzels all morning until you get to your lunch. You might stay full. Why? Because you created a balanced meal for yourself according to Mediterranean principles. And doing that sets you up for success from a weight loss perspective. But it's not just that eating Mediterranean foods guarantees you weight loss. You still have to think about the total calories you're consuming. That's always true when we're thinking about weight loss. So it's a potential bonus. It's not necessarily the main event. It often happens for a lot of people, though, because if they're switching into Mediterranean approach from a typical Western or let's say American style of eating, my goodness, they're going to be dramatically changing the amount of nutrition in their food, in their diet overall. And that often will automatically kick off some weight loss process for them. So, okay. So I think that clarifies that. Myth number 4 then is that on the other side of the spectrum, oh, Mediterranean is a plant-based diet. So that must mean it's just plants, right? Well, so here's the thing. I think the term plant-based has really been thrown around way too much and is confusing people because plant-based doesn't mean plant exclusive. It is not vegan. Like there's no question. Mediterranean approach to eating and Mediterranean cultures are not vegan cultures. They eat plenty of animal-based foods, eggs, some dairy, some red meat as well, but lots of fish, of course. So it's a really balanced diet. Now you can make it vegan or vegetarian. There's no problem with that, but it's often like omnivorous, meaning you're eating many types of foods. And that is true for people who are traditionally eating this way inside their culture, the way they've been eating for hundreds and thousands of years. And so the point of Mediterranean is this focus on the balance, like we've been talking about, but the quality of the ingredients rather than strictly eliminating anything. And I would also argue that's true of literally any healthy diet. The quality of the food or the quality of the diet overall matters so much, almost more than the specific foods you're necessarily eating. And this is something that's not talked about enough and I think confuses people. Now, there's room for debate here. I don't think a lot of this is super proven. And so you have to decide for yourself what you believe a little bit. Like the science is never going to tell you everything you have to know. I am really into culture and how that impacts our health overall. And people being able to eat their traditional way, I think is super important for their health overall, their mental health as well. And so You just want to consider that. I know lots of examples of people from the US, for example, they'll go over to Europe for vacation, and for the first time they can eat gluten, or for the first time they can consume pasta and grains and foods that they can't eat when they're home in the US, because typically they get a symptom like a stomach ache or headaches or brain fog or fatigue. But then when they're over there, they felt fantastic. There's something to be said about that. I think there's no question food tastes different in certain parts of the world. Quality differs from one place to another. The quality of our food supply is super important, and it's hard. It's hard to fix that. It's not really easy. So some people resort to growing some of their own food. Other people resort to just buying organic if they can afford it. You have to decide what's right for you. Sometimes it means eating certain things from certain grocery stores, but not from others. You decide. You decide what makes sense for you. Okay, and then our last myth, but not the and then this is just a summary. I kind of already addressed this in the last slide. So, Mediterranean week or a Mediterranean approach actually looks like there's a combination of several types of foods. It could be fish and seafood, poultry and eggs. There's dairy. Think about Greek food, for example. There's feta cheese and tzatziki, which is Greek yogurt. There's no truth to saying that dairy is not eaten and dairy is bad across the board. Like, it kind of depends on what dairy we're talking about, and it depends on if you're someone who gets symptoms from dairy or not, if it's good for you. And then same thing with the red meat. I'm not of the belief that red meat is bad for all of us all the time. A lot of my colleagues in the world of medicine today have kind of gone really vegan, and this is me just being upfront and honest with you guys. I don't personally promote veganism with any patients or anyone online. If someone wants to be vegan, I absolutely support them. There's so many great reasons that people want to choose to eat that way, especially when it comes to like ethics. But from a pure health standpoint, I don't really see that argument is valid from the science, especially because you get so much bang for your buck nutritionally when you're eating things like poultry or red meat or dairy, in terms of how much protein, how many grams of protein you get in that individual food. And it makes you really satisfied. Some people don't do well just eating beans and grains. Like, I'm telling you, I've seen this myself from a clinical standpoint. I've also experienced this myself. I spent several years being vegetarian, and I enjoyed it very much. And when my body was ready to change, it let me know with symptoms. And you have to follow your own health journey. So this is why across the board, I don't promote any one specific set of foods that everybody needs to strictly follow. I think you got to decide what's right for you. I also decide as a person, not just as a doctor, but as a person, what's right for me. It's good to educate yourself. It's good to ask questions. But the cool thing about Mediterranean is it's very versatile. You can make it work for you no matter where you're at in your health journey and what you want to do with it. And then, so last but not least, myth number 5. I hear this one all the time. Probably some of you have thought of it yourself, and it's a real concern because food is expensive right now. I hope that changes. Remains to be seen, but groceries have gotten phenomenally expensive, and I don't mean that in a positive way, over the last several years, like post COVID. And this is hard. Like, this can be a big barrier for a lot of people. So, what you want to think about is that because Mediterranean eating, it does emphasize quality. Sometimes that means you do have to buy maybe the more expensive items on the shelf compared to the ones that have a lot of additives and things that make them last longer on the grocery store shelves. So, in a certain way, when you're focusing on quality, you can think at the surface, oh, darn, that means I have to buy the more expensive versions of this stuff. But if you really break down the total math that you do overall, if you want to eat a really balanced diet and you don't need to eat meat based products or animal based products at every meal, this can be an extremely cost effective way of eating, because you're also automatically going to cut out a lot of extra stuff in your diet that is not really serving your health. So you're going to cut out a lot of the added sugar, the added oils, the added salty foods, like all these processed things that are not part of a whole foods, balanced Mediterranean approach to eating that's emphasizing like simple, sustainable eating that is very high in quality and is kind of rooted in these traditional recipes, like you're just going to cut out a lot of the extra stuff, like, the chips and the cookies and all the snack foods that are really not that great for us. So like the point is, um, one could argue that it's hard, but the reality is that if you really do it classically, it's simple. Like these are simple recipes. You don't have to be fancy. You don't have to buy fancy ingredients. And it actually can be a lot cheaper and more cost effective overall if you needed it to be, if that's where your budget's at. So I also like to make the point here when we talk about cost that I know groceries are expensive. I'm a person and I have to buy groceries for myself and my family too. But the cool thing is that if you're eating a lot of like nutrient dense foods that your body gets full from, you don't necessarily have to buy as much total food because you're going to get full. Again, if you don't need to be snacking a lot, um, then you don't buy the snack foods. It would be interesting. You guys should calculate in your typical grocery store run how much, and do this experiment. I've done it myself. It's very eye opening. How much of your grocery list is are foods that are really serving your health and how much are just kind of extra for fun snack foods, and then like do the math, like tally up the total cost of like the essential health foods, so all of like your your vegetables, your fruits, your eggs, your milk, your meat or your yogurt, like those kinds of like whole foods that are really good for our health and they give us a lot of nutrition. How much of your grocery list is that stuff versus like the pretzels, the ice cream, the chips, like the ranch dip, like all those extras, and just see the math and then you can start to kind of think about where you can shave some dollars off if you really need to cut costs. Ideally, you cut costs in a way that supports your health and doesn't derail it. So I think that's it for our myths. And oh gosh, yep, I've been talking more than 1 hour as I usually end up doing. So we're gonna end the live stream here again. If any of you had jumped on later in the call, um, oh, somebody said great advice on grocery list items. Fantastic. Glad you guys liked it. Hopefully, when people watch the replay, they'll make it all the way till the end of this hour. I'm going to post this. So we will do more live streams. Again, join me this Saturday. That's in 4 days. Today is November 12th, and it's November 15th, Saturday at noon or 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm going live again. I would love for all of you to join me there. And until then, have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.